Terminology Leading Practice stream of SNOMED CT Expo 2020. My name is Yongshen Gao, and I'm a senior terminologist at SNOMED International. I will be moderating today's session. Please use the QA box to type your questions to the presenter. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. I'm now pleased to introduce Graham Ponting, an independent consultant from the UK. Graham has clinical experience in the NHS and involved in implementations of clinical systems. He will be investigating a mapping between the HPO, Human Phenotype Ontology, and the SNOMED CT to support the continuity of care and healthcare strategy across the community. Graham, please proceed. Now it's over to you.
Hello, and welcome everybody. We'll go straight to the introduction, I think. Okay, I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing on SNOMED CT and the Human Phenotype Ontology. SNOMED CT, as we know, is owned and managed by SNOMED International and is the leading healthcare terminology worldwide. In the NHS, it is the mandated clinical terminology for recording information at the point of care. We're going to talk largely about disorders and findings hierarchy, but it's worth pointing out at this stage that in terms of causation, clinicians talk about, and this is reflected in SNOMED causation as the main model for disease rather than observation. The Human Phenotype Ontology is widely used within the genomics community for the description and identification of genomic disease and data. It has been so since 2007. Its use is predicated on the definition of a phenotype itself, and one useful definition for from the internet is the observations relate to the physical, morphological, or biochemical level of an individual, as determined by the genotype and the environment. So we're starting to see that there are slight differences in the way that SNOMED and the Human Phenotype Ontology work together. Okay, let's have a look at HPO in more detail. The phenotype abnormality hierarchy is a relatively small terminology, just over 14,000 terms at the beginning of this year. But in general, as we say, they're aligned to the clinical findings and disorders SNOMED hierarchy, which has about 120,000 terms. The HPL also has a large number of annotations which can be used to describe and identify phenotypes, as well as links to the genetic databases OMIM and Orphanet. But we're not going to discuss those today, and that weren't part of the study. HPO was developed by Sebastian Kohler and Peter Robinson as part of the Monarch Initiative maintained by them at the Jackson Institute in Connecticut. HPO is a polyhierarchy with multiple parents managed through ISA relationships, which are transitive, much in the same way as SNOMED, but not to the same extent. HPO has supporting synonyms and definitions and a general comment which provides contextual information, which is important to support general use and the mapping, which I did. It does have pre-coordinated terms at the beginning, often such as severe, short, reduced, recurrent, progressive, etc., similar to the SNOMED qualifiers. An example, for example, is severe B lymphocytopenia. There has been work on mapping previously, which was done by de Hombres and Bodenreiter, and they found about a third were direct maps. Sorry, just slightly slow to transition there. Okay, looking at the content, the second level hierarchy, there are about 25 concepts. which mainly align to the systems in other terminologies. But what you can see immediately is that the limbs and skeletal system, if you put them together, constitute about 50% of the terms. And this is because there's a detailed analysis of the hands, arms, feet, and limbs. And if you look at, for example, at the fingers, there's about 600 terms just describing the phalangeal bones and metacarpal bones and the diseases thereabouts. And about 10% of the terms describe the feet and the hands. Underlying these subtypes are a series of investigations and scans which go across all of the systems, and there's about 2,000 of them. So there's an important group of results and findings in relation to the results. Okay, so looking at a patient journey, and we're often talking about patients either that are pregnant with children or cancer or rare diseases. If they refer themselves to a GP, they'll be referred then to, if they have a genomic problem, to the secondary care system, clinical genetics service, and they'll often undergo detailed investigations under the lab and radiology systems. HPO might be used by the geneticists and they might be used in the lab rad systems. And again, where the data is coordinated and analyzed across the patient journey, they'll be used to identify patients with rare diseases. So the use case for this mapping is really anywhere where HPO and SNOMED are used together in this patient journey. So let's look at the objectives of the study, and they were to identify one-to-one and one-to-many maps, which were direct maps between HPO and SNOMED. And this is really looking at the terms, the synonyms, and the contextual hierarchy of both to match the two. If there's no direct map, then we use or created an expression using SNOMED CT compositional grammar, or a map to the local parent if there was no expression available. As you might expect, there were a number of clarifications and confirmations that were required, and a small number were out of scope. Also, I described the main principles, issues, and assumptions, which were an important part of the project. Okay, let's look at the methods, which were direct, manual, and relatively simple. On the left, we have the Protégé tool, which many of you may be familiar with. You can load the OWL file directly from the website for HPO, and this shows the hierarchy quite nicely on the left. On the right-hand side, we have this SNOMED International browser displaying the international edition. And we can see that, for example, we can map abnormality of the year quite easily to disorder of the year, and then click and get a concept and definition, and we manage the results. I manage the results in an Access database, but also see that the subtypes of abnormality of the year are morphology and physiology, and this does give a bit of a problem in terms of cross-mapping, which we'll discuss in the next slide. Okay, so how do we handle morphology and physiology? And that's quite a critical question. There are three options, really. The default one is congenital anomaly, and often the morphology terms align to the congenital anomaly term of the relevant system. In this case, however, they align more precisely to disorders of the ear, mainly just looking at the subtypes and contextual hierarchy. If we look at physiology, and most of the times these will probably be out of scope, but here Again, looking at the hierarchy, I mapped to ear and auditory findings, not disorders of the ear. So there are options for mapping, but this is very much taken on an individual basis. Okay, SNOMED CT compositional grammar is a lightweight syntax for the representation of a SNOMED expression. It's both human readable and machine parsable. It is governed by the concept model, which defines the structure, and the APG parser, which defines the grammar. And there's a link to the SNOMED International website where you can check individual expressions. An example is given here of a clinical finding, attribute, and qualifier, a triple. An example from the HPO list is jejunal arteriovenous malformation, whereas if you simply add a finding site, which is the commonest attribute of jejunal structure, you get a simple expression which represents the refinement and meaning of the HPO concept. Okay, let's look at the results. Okay, direct mapping, which is what we're mostly interested in, was 47%. 46% were one-to-one, and one-to-many is 1.2%. The map expression, which we created, was, and there were nearly 5,000 of these, was 34%, or just about a third. A map to a local parent, which is really identifying the SNOMED gap, if you like, was 18.5%. There are a small number of clarifications and confirmations, as you might expect, and 330 were out of scope. These were largely navigational concepts. But some of this data is still under QA, particularly the expressions, so the figures might change very slightly in the future. If we look at which hierarchies do they map to, as you might expect, they map to the disorders and findings, mostly 73% to the disorders, but with a small number to morphology and situation. But 99% within findings and disorders. And this is important because it means there is a big overlap between HPO and SNOMED. Okay, looking at the expressions in a bit more detail, and particularly the attributes that we used. As we said, the commonest was finding site with nearly 3,000, and this was often used just on its own, so it's a simple attribute to add. Next was in relation to the laboratory investigations, has interpretation or interprets, so this was the next commonest, reflecting the investigations, and then associated morphology, clinical course, and severity. And of course, these all can be used either on their own or in combination according to the various grammatical and concept model rules. An example of a more complex expression, well, we've seen the simple expression here with a simple refinement, which is just adding a body site, gives meaning or SNOMED meaning to the HPO term, so that we've defined it carefully and it can be used further in a number of ways. A more complex expression, which will probably not get included in a SNOMED term, is around Parkinsonism and the treatment. So Parkinsonism, positive response to medication from dopamine, using 3 different attributes there, a complex expression. But it does define the meaning exactly in SNOMED terms. So where were the gaps? As you might expect, around fingers and toes and hands, there was a significant gap. Also around substance level and lymphocyte findings, in particular, the investigations of lymphocytes over the past few years have expanded rapidly and are very detailed. There is also a gap, or at least it needs more examination around EEG findings, and I admit my knowledge of EEGs is fairly limited, and around congenital abnormalities of the external ear, which are defined to some level of detail in HPO. So problems during mapping. First one we've already alluded to, that's the use of morphology and physiology groupings that have no direct corollary within SNOMED. But actually, if these terms were excluded, which is probably a valid thing to do, it doesn't make any difference in percentage terms. The context was not always clear in terms of congenital versus acquired, and there were differences in modeling between the two ontologies, which you would expect, but there are also inconsistencies and inaccuracies in both terminologies, which did create some problems in cross-mapping, particularly missing definitions, abbreviations, etc. And SNOMED's use of eponyms was not terribly helpful, as these are not always commonly understood. In addition, there are apparent differences in meaning of relatively common terms, such as encephalopathy, a different meaning in both ontologies. So there were difficult areas and difficult modelings, as you would expect. So in summary of the results, 47% of HPO concepts mapped directly to SNOMED terms, of which most were within the findings hierarchy. A further 34% were able to be mapped to an expression and 19% to a local parent. Most, that is 98% of HPO terms were mapped to the scope and findings, diagnosis hierarchies, with small numbers to the morphology and situation hierarchies. Analysis of those mapped to local parents showed that the content gap was largely in relation to congenital anomalies of the hands, feet, and ears, as well as terms covering substance levels in the blood. Small numbers were designated as out of scope, as you might expect. In conclusion, the direct mappings of HPO to SNOMED were 47%, is higher than found previously by Bodenreiter et al., possibly because they took an indirect approach using UMLS, whereas I took a much more direct and simple approach. The use of expressions provides a precise definition of the meaning of an HPO term in SNOMED terms, which can be used either as a prerequisite for authoring or as part of an EPR reporting solution, etc. So it provides a precise definition. Looking at all the mappings suggests there is an extensive overlap between HPO and SNOMED, as more than 97% of the HPO content is within the current scope of findings and disorders. This study provides a good understanding of the content which could be added to SNOMED to support direct mapping, although it's recommended this should be supported by post-coordination where possible to take full advantage of the SNOMED content, such as body site, to reduce the number of terms required. The mapping tables do have a need further validation with the involvement of interested parties and adoption and publishing by the relevant groups. So the availability of a complete map would enable continuity of information between genomics and the wider healthcare community, as well as supporting the identification of rare diseases. References are included. I'd just like to highlight the work of de Hombres and Bodenreiter. There are other references available to look in more detail at their work. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Graham, for your presentation. Can I ask the attendees give us a moment while we switch over from our pre-recorded content so that Graham can address the questions you have been submitting. Please also note that this session will be available on the event platform for the next 3 months. Hi, welcome to the live Q&A session. I'm Yongsheng Gao from SNOMED International. Firstly, I would like to thank Graham for the great presentation. Let's look at the questions from our audience. The question, what is meant by the HPO terms are generally aligned to the clinical finding disorder in SNOMED hierarchy regarding the terminology or the definition?
Yeah, this is not always an easy split. For example, whether, and the follow-up question here, whether a map is to a disease or a morphological abnormality. There is some overlap in the hierarchies themselves. But one example, for example, is something like hyperkeratosis or neurofibromatosis. These are concepts which exist within morphological abnormality, but within disorders, they'll be mapped to a specific site or system. But yeah, not always an easy decision as to which they map to. I can give you a full list of mappings if that would be helpful.
Thanks, Graham. Can you give an example for mapping to morphological abnormality?
Yeah,
yeah.
I gave a couple just then in terms of neurofibromatosis and hyperkeratosis, and there are others. There are a small number. I can give a full list separately if that's helpful.
I think there's a kind of tricky question and 2 questions. What's next? What is needed to get this adopted? And the second is, does the DL classifier reasoner generate anything interesting since you are using the post-coordination? Have you tried to classify to see anything different or same compared to SNOMED? I think the question really tried to ask. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't used the DL classifier reasoner yet. It's very much been done as an individual product with individual mappings, but part of the next step is in validating the expressions in that way. It's done very much on an individual basis and validating through the APG parser and using the human readable concept model rather than the machine readable. But yeah, that is the next step. About getting it implemented, I think this is just a first step. There's a lot of discussion down the way, and hopefully this will contribute to getting a mapping approved at a more central level and possibly an international level. So it's just a first step on the way. We need to validate the mapping and perhaps have some additional content in SNOMED to improve the number of one-to-one mappings.
Yeah, since you mentioned about mappings, I think there are questions 2 actually related to. One is about, is there any mapping between HPO and the SNOMED using UMLS? So what role does the UMLS play in the current landscape of terminology in this 2020 now? Yeah.
Well, there is a mapping, although I haven't seen it in detail. There is a mapping using UMLS. I don't think I'm qualified to say about the role of UMLS in the current landscape. There may be others on the call that can contribute in that area. But online, and in fact, when you if you put HPO into Protégé, you see the SNOMED mappings, which are, as I understand it, are through UMLS. So you can see them as individual mappings, but I don't think there's a list of mappings available, for example.
Thanks. I think the other question also relates to mapping. Does the term also map to ICD-11 where relevant?
I think I haven't done that assessment, to be honest. The mapping to ICD-10 or 11, I think, would not be as good, for example. I remember when I did some rare disease mapping, the mapping will just be much less precise, and the number of one-to-one maps would be very much reduced. I think that's all I can say about ICD-10 and ICD-11.
Thanks. I think this question about the morphologies, earlier on asked about the morphology. Actually, this is more specific. Say, would expect that no HPO code should map to a morphology abnormality. Might look lexically attractive, but in all cases, would expect that the correct map should be always between the expression of a clinical finding and associated with morphology in this way.
I think that depends how the HPO concept is defined, and supporting information to understand, because some of the HPO concepts are very specific and really only deal with, for example, a histological reaction or very detailed cytological studies. So they only belong in the morphology hierarchy. And in fact aren't well covered in SNOMED. Does that answer the question? Maybe perhaps you can come back if you don't think I've answered that question completely.
Yeah, we have this recording, and also you can always follow up and have a chat with Graham. I think another question is about will there be any quality improvements where you found anomalies in one or both terminology, basically to compare these two to see any quality issues? For the expression, how are they represented in your mapping file in contrast to the code to code, like a one-to-one map?
I think, yeah, I'd like there to be, if you like, feedback and discussion on both sides with SNOMED and HPO to improve the number of maps. So hopefully, yes, that will follow on. As I said earlier, I think this is the start of the discussion, and I think Ian Green briefly mentioned yesterday that there's still a lot more discussion to go on in terms of the mapping between HPO and SNOMED and the use of the two, and the generation of content, etc. So this is just the start of the process.
Thanks. Did Jim Case answer the question about the mapping related to ICD-11? And ICD-11 has planned to integrate HPO directly, so there would be a direct map. I think that's good. We got an answer. I think.
Yeah, be difficult to understand how that would work, because HPO is so more detailed than ICD-11, as I understand it. So I have to look at the detail, but I can't really see how it would be a one-to-one map. But I may be wrong on that, because I've just not done that exercise. But it's certainly an interesting one to do, and an important one to do.
Thanks. There are other few questions, but we run out of time. And thank you all for participating in the live Q&A session. And hope you enjoy your time at the Expo. And we start the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.